wonderful to be here to talk about, as Phil points out, the only answer to everything, which is politics. Politics and policy are two sides of a coin, basically. Good politics makes good policy, and good policy makes good politics. And in a perfect world, they would all be based on rationality and good thought and cause and effect, you know, that stuff we like cause and effect. In reality, John Kennedy said it best when some young person complained about politics, and John Kennedy looked at him and said, "Kid, life is unfair." That insight helps you see that when we talk about politics, we've had a day of wonderful rationality. I've learned a lot. I feel like the kid in the Larson cartoon who raised his hand and says, "Teacher, can I leave the room? My brain is full." A lot of great information, great arguments, and those get you part of the way to where we need to go, but they don't get you all of the way because politics is filled with good arguments that lose and bad arguments that win. It would be wonderful if truth prevailed, logic prevailed, and then the universities could be called upon to run society. Would it surprise you to know that that has yet to occur? Partly because politics is the one field, this is why it's democracy. You can have everything. You can have truth. You can have falsehood. You can have rationality, irrationality. You can have unconscious forces shaping your opinions. You could have a thoughtful analysis where you checklist your position on issues, and that leads to your ideology. Don't forget, there's always the prevailing factor, the greatest enduring factor in political life, which is ignorance. This is the immovable rock of all politics. If you can win, it's not because you make everybody understand the issue, but that you can get an effective majority among those who might or might not understand, and God help you, some of those people in your majority are with you thinking they're supposed to be on the other team. 10% of voters in 1980 believed that Ronald Reagan was the most liberal candidate in the presidential race. This was incorrect. Just wanted to point out for those of you who are wondering, gee, I didn't know he was that liberal. I thought he was kind of conservative. No, there's an astounding amount of ignorance in American society, and the great thing about politics is you accept that as part of the water you swim in. This is why professors have so much trouble in politics. Professors want to correct the voters. This is why professors rarely get elected to office, which we'll talk about a little bit. So I want to talk about higher education in the age of Obama from a political standpoint. I'm going to take the policies of Obama in higher education and decode them for you as political statements, not as policy statements. He's a pretty shrewd guy. He doesn't have all the answers, but you can usually tell with him, if you study him for 3 years, two things. One is he's a creature of habit, like most people in politics, and the other is he's learning from experience. Those two things are happening, and you'll see both of those in his policies. And then I'm going to finish with what we ought to do about that, what openings are created by these policies. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to do this. Excuse me. So this is going to be sort of the politics of higher education in the age of Obama. And I'm sure this, okay. Let's start with the fact that we're not nurses. I'm sorry, I gotta be me. Okay, if we were nurses, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Nurses win every political battle they are in. There's a 5-foot-tall woman who's the head of the nurses union, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, said he was going to kick the asses of all the nurses in California. And she stood up to her full 5 feet height and said, "You are not," and she kicked his ass. And he then said, "What happened?" If professors were as seen as valuable as nurses, we would not be holding this meeting right now. We'd be trying to decide what to do with all the extra money. Maybe we should have a party. Because Americans are very ambivalent about higher education. We're very ambivalent about professors. We're not ambivalent about education up until college. The ambivalence starts after college. And therefore, This word professor, I'm fascinated by it because I've been out of academia, in academia, I've seen it from a lot of sides. Some of the things we associate, too academic. When I was executive director of the Charter Commission, whenever my commissioners were annoyed at me, they would think of the meanest thing they could say. They would say, that was really, I'm sorry to say this, academic. I'd say, Jesus, I am an academic. They didn't think that was funny. Never met a budget. Well, that's not true, but they think never paid a bill, never hired anybody because you're professors. Never ran anything. Pie in the sky, but the real kicker is that we think we're smarter than everybody else. This, of course, is not true. My theory is that the reason this year is so unusual is Americans have turned on the rich. Before that, we always turned on the well-educated, because it was the well-educated who looked down on the ordinary person who could grow up and become rich. This is a year I'm not used to, where suddenly it's okay to be a professor as long as you're not a CEO of a venture capital company. This is unusual, because Americans have ambivalent feelings about professors. I have ambivalent feelings about this thing. Okay. I put up some figures from American political history to drive this point home. One is the first person I walked a precinct for. Obviously, he's in black and white because I'm old. That is Adlai Stevenson up here, who everybody thought was a professor, but wasn't, but was sort of the avatar of the educated class of America in the 1950s. My parents adored Adlai Stevenson, so I did too. He gave rise to the term egghead because of his head. So people said he was an egghead. It's also one place we see where intellectuals sort of get in trouble. A woman raised her hand at a rally and said, Governor Stevenson, all thinking people are behind you. And he said, ma'am, I need a majority. Looking back, I decided that was not the best thing he could have said. But you see, it's kind of revealing. Then we have Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Actually, no, excuse me. Woodrow Wilson, the only person with a PhD to be president of the United States. How do you think he would do on the current test, have a beer with? Hey, Tommy Wilson, let's go get drunk. Didn't happen. And then we have Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in my view, the only intellectual to ever successfully parry the attack of being too well educated. Harvard professor, 1976, runs for the Senate in New York. He's facing James Buckley, the incumbent, who turns to him and opens the debate and says, Professor Moynihan. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan turns to him and says, ah, the mudslinging begins. He won the debate, was elected senator, and was very, very popular. For a current example, we have Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, running against Playgirl centerfold U.S. Senator Scott Brown, who in every political moment in the campaign refers to her as Harvard Professor Elizabeth Warren. Look it up. He obviously has a consultant who says, call her a Harvard professor. It's like calling her an axe murderer. And this is in the state where Harvard is. Don't get me started. So what it suggests, though, is a sobering beginning to this discussion about politics. And to go back to the point, we're not nurses. And if we were, we'd be much better off in this discussion. We're the people who are figures of respect and also perceived as thinking we're smarter than everybody else. When I started getting called professor, I was very impressed with myself, until the guys on my softball team started calling me professor, and it had a tone to it that I suddenly realized was kind of sarcastic. I'd rather be professor than doctor, because if I'm Dr. Sunshine, someone might come to me if they have back trouble. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon, shows a maitre d' at a restaurant, and he's on the phone and he says, Dr. Jones, oh, is that a real doctor or just a PhD? So anyway, it's all part of our culture. It's a problem for us, because we tend to think that the respect side is bigger than it is, and we don't realize how many people think we look down on them. And that's kind of an issue. By the way, if you run for office in this country and you're a college professor, call yourself a college teacher. You'll go up 5 points in the polls. I wrote to a friend of mine yesterday, knowing I was coming here, to ask him if that was true from his data. He said, I have no data whatsoever, but any professor on the ballot is a French-speaking, quiche-eating, left-wing liberal. I said, okay. I said, all right, well, yes. It's an issue. Bonjour. Yes. Now, our good old President Obama, who's a very smart guy, when people don't like what he says, they say he is professorial. I've seen this like 100 times. It's nice. Nobody ever says like, he's like a nurse. I mean, that would be a positive. So, you know, this guy Kuhn says the professor-in-chief has his drawbacks. Time magazine says taking Professor Obama's class. CNN says a little less professorial, less academic, and more ordinary. The guy did go to like some big schools, so he's supposed to be ordinary. That's the type of phraseology that makes you appear aloof and out of touch. Now, of course, when you are pretty smart and pretend not to be, you can make the opposite mistake, aka if you've heard the last 20 Mitt Romney speeches, where he says the trees are just the right height. I'm sorry, but it's not quite like nothing to fear but fear itself. He said, the trees are the right height. Yep, that's good. Yep. Somebody pointed out that trees grow. If he comes back in November, will they then be the wrong height? Anyway, we won't go there because that would be tacky. Now, we're on to Obama's plan. I find his plan fascinating because I'm looking at it as a political person, not as a policy person. I know I should look at it as a policy person because that would be good. But I'm going to look at it as a political person. The first thing about understanding his plan is that he's creating something pretty big. I wouldn't quite call it an entitlement, but it's somewhere between who cares and an entitlement. I don't have a word for that yet. Making college education affordable and expected. Now, this is kind of part of what's gone on in his administration. When he first came in, he came in as kind of a Harvard president. And he followed the mistake that most Democratic presidents make, which is hiring a bunch of professors from Harvard to propose insane policies that sound marvelous because they're said by somebody from Harvard. I'm speaking of Larry Summers and some of his friends who are essentially have no idea what they're talking about, but that cost him a lot in the polls. And it made him seem like he was more interested in austerity for everybody than helping the middle class. They had a bit of an epiphany this year and discovered that being for the middle class is actually the Democratic Party's major goal, and that it could also be popular because most Americans are middle class. Even those who are rich call themselves middle class. Those who are poor call themselves middle class. There are 4 poor people and 6 rich people in the United States and 310 million middle class people. Sometimes the simplest math is the easy one. 310 million is greater than the sum total of 3 and 4, or whatever bogus number I just came up with. This is very important, though, because by putting this out there, and you've heard from some of the other speakers, for the first time, the White House is taking the position that the federal government has a real position in higher education. That's really quite new. I don't mean providing financial aid. I don't mean providing research grants. I mean suggesting that college should be for everybody. This is going to turn out to be extremely important. Then there's some other pieces of this, of these sets of policies. The first one is that the president has gone after private for-profit colleges and banks who were given, as you heard earlier, this tremendous boondoggle in student aid, where we would pay the banks to hand federal money essentially over to kids for which they would charge and then have their losses insured by the federal government. Wonderful concept. But he took on the banks, and he's been taking on the for-profit schools. What's the message of that? Typical Obama. Row a little to the left, row a little bit to the right, and you'll end up kind of in the center. What he says first is, I'm taking on the biggest threat to public education in the United States. For-profit schools, we're going to regulate them harder than everybody. We're going to get student aid directly to the students that establishes some credibility. But here's what we never understood. There's a second part to that. If we're going to hold them accountable, we're going to hold the rest of you accountable too. And that's where the rest of his proposal comes from. But he led with a very difficult political fight here to also prove, by the way, something which is quite profitable in American politics, that I am not he who is not to be named. You understand, poor Mr. Bush's name has not appeared in any of the Republican debates. The last Republican president was Ronald Reagan. By the way, the first Republican president was also Ronald Reagan. It always helps if you're a Democrat, by the way, to remind people that George W. Bush was president. So it has a lot of benefits politically. Then he did the good stuff, the fun stuff. More grants, more loans for students, promising to work with Congress, which is a funny concept when you think of it, to prevent on July 1st the interest rates on student loans from going up to some godforsaken thing. That's like a lot of money. I know that because I have kids in college, and I actually watch the interest rates at this point. So this is really good stuff. This is like the nice stuff that you put out. More consumer information, customer service, we all know about that. I'd like you to present a really excellent argument against that. Okay, I thought so. We're pretty good at that, by the way, as has been already pointed out. Our universities are pretty, our Cal States are pretty good at that. You'd be amazed how many people said, this is more sensitive than the attorney-client privilege. We can't tell you how many students graduate. We can't tell you what they do afterwards because, oh my God. Well, obviously, that's really a no-brainer. And then here's the big one. But I'm going to have to come back to it by first doing these two right here. We will reward states that support higher education. We're going to come back to that one because that is a really difficult one to pull off. By the way, if he does pull that one off, I believe Iran will definitely not build a nuclear weapon. The race to the top. I hate these slogans, by the way. I just have this vision of a bunch of overweight teachers running to the top of a mountain and then like dying before they get there on the race to the top. I'm not racing to the top. I'm walking, by the way. If that. I'm sending Phil. I'm just going to stay at the bottom. The race to the top, which they've used below higher education. And by the way, if you were those other schools, would you rather be known as lower education if we were higher education? Okay, I just thought I'd throw that out there. Is measurable objectives. These are inevitable, graduation rates, et cetera, so we can sound a little bit more like business people. They're now talking about doing that, sending out money for states that do a great job, and then individual schools would get rewards for doing a great job. And then that gets back to this one up here that I just love. This, to me, is a beautiful Obama-ism, which is either brilliant or not. I can't decide. It may be both. But let's just unpack this a little bit. Keep tuition low. The money quote, if you can't stop tuition from going up, then the funding you get from taxpayers will go down. There's some problems with this. This is meant to be a carrot and a stick. I'd also call it a chicken and an egg. If I'm Harvard, I read this as busted. If I'm Cal State Fullerton and Cal State Los Angeles, I say, could you explain to me what this sentence actually means to us? Because what's going to happen to us is we can't stop tuition from going up because the funding from taxpayers has gone down. Now, here's my interpretation of this. This is not aimed at us. And one of the political things to keep in mind as this education reform thing happens or not is don't take offense at things that aren't really aimed at us and get in a gigantic fight by pointing out that this makes no sense to us whatsoever. But I'll tell you the people it does make sense to are the schools who are jacking up their costs, jacking up their tuition almost randomly knowing the federal government is going to come in with lots of money. This is not about us, unless we make it about us, which would be a very foolish thing to do. In fact, I would say, yep, I agree with that sentence, because it doesn't really have to do with us. It has a lot more to do with health care. Think about Obama's health care plan. He creates a new entitlement that everybody should get affordable health care. In order to make that work and keep Medicare from exploding, you have to hold down the explosion of costs. And their analysis of health care was that the government was pouring in unlimited amounts into Medicare, and then the health care providers were just writing that off as more spending. Does that sound familiar? Isn't that what we just heard this morning? About colleges that are ramping up their spending and ramping up the tuition because the feds will come in and pay for it. It's not about us, unless we choose to take it that way, which would be, in my view, a political mistake. He's using the same model here that he's using for health care. And it's also a model that says, if I cut costs, I'll have the credibility to create this new semi-entitlement. But what a catastrophe if you have a policy that gets everybody guaranteed college, practically, and doesn't limit costs. It can't work. So again, don't take offense before it's the right time. I'll tell you, by the way, we'll get to the part you should take offense at, but not that part, because it's not about us. It's about those schools that are doing that. It's the schools that, I don't understand, by the way, why some of these schools with all this money charge tuition at all. They don't need it. I think they charge tuition for fun. Because like if it's not expensive, how good could it be? If you're going to buy a fake masterpiece, you better charge a lot for it. If you're going to sell a fake masterpiece. I'm not saying a Harvard education, by the way, is a fake masterpiece. Some departments probably, but not really so. But think about that. Why do those schools even consider tuition when they have endowments of colossal amounts and don't really need it? Do I need to point out that, again, that's not us? We don't have that $10 billion. Why does this keep moving on me? You're moving it? I am more and more concerned about the next generation. They are shoving us aside before we are ready to go. I just got a new job. I didn't retire. All right? Okay, thank you. This is my favorite Obamaism, by the way, and only Obama, who I just love dearly, could come up with this particular exhortation. States have to do their part by making higher education a higher priority in their budget. There's my one. I just need a second on this one to leave that thought out there. What? So I guess governors reading that will say, holy crap, I've been cutting higher education. Who knew? Let's see if we can put the money back. By the way, it's not quite as naive as it appears, although it does appear a little on the naive side. So not long after the plan came back, Florida and Pennsylvania very happily announced $100 million more of cuts to higher education with great fanfare and great excitement. Actually, an interesting little straw in the wind, the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, opposed the cut in higher education because he's getting some heat. We're going to talk about heat at the very end of this. Anything that changes Rick Scott's mind has to be astounding. But the legislature cut the funding anyway, even without us. In Pennsylvania, the governor is cutting tremendous amounts. And just for fun, the governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Corbett, included a commission to carry out Obama's education reforms. I'm from New Jersey. I would interpret that as something that's usually accompanied by a hand gesture that I don't really feel comfortable with Dr. Hagan and our new president here. I'm just not going to show it. But first cut, you first take line one and say, may I show you what I'm going to do to line one? And by the way, colleges must be much more value-driven and affordable, and I'm going to adopt all those reform ideas. So right off the bat, it didn't work too hot. It also, there's a danger that we have to think about, that all this talk about having higher education justify itself is in the context of a bigger debate that's questioning public education as a whole. And I don't know how much you're paying attention to some of the extreme debates going on in American society. There's a quiet little debate starting about renaming public schools as government schools. Now, by the way, when you start referring to public schools as government schools, it's because you want to abolish them. These are schools where indoctrination is done by crazy teachers who are teaching our kids horrible things. It's a government indoctrination. They're starting to call them government schools. But be wary. It's not only a debate between us and the president. Wouldn't that be fun? Like a little family discussion. There's this other debate going on as well. So we got to watch that one. Former Senator Santorum, again, one of the really most level-headed people I've seen in politics in many years, and I mean really level-headed, has some fascinating ideas on education. Said the other day that he misses the days when we lived on farms and we were homeschooled or went to school in little red schoolhouses, but instead we moved to cities where there were factories, and then we created, quote, factory schools. So the point is, this debate is bigger than our debate about whether we should keep statistics. There's like other stuff going on. Well, go ahead, come on. Live a little. Now, one of the problems is the federal government, to achieve that first goal, has less leverage than if, during the stimulus program, they had not cut off all the money to states and cities. In order to get the last vote for Obama's stimulus plan in 2009, he had to give Senator Susan Collins of Maine one thing. So what did Susan Collins ask for? The one thing that economists said would have the single biggest impact in the stimulus plan, which was roughly $40 billion in aid to state and local governments. And since then, state and local governments have been cutting money. So do you see it makes it kind of hard for the feds to come in and say, you support public education during a recession when I've just not given you any money during the recession. And meanwhile, we have to keep in mind the subtext of all this is class conflict within our university system. At least 4 levels: community colleges, state universities like us, the UCs, whatever we call them, and then the elite private universities. And in a way, what Obama's plan is doing, I think maybe not intentionally, is creating a political conflict among those and maybe isolating the elite private universities as among the biggest cost drivers in the system. And trust me, that's true. They are really, you saw the numbers already this morning. That just shows, by the way, if you don't overreact to all the proposals, there's actually some political room that's empowering to our level of education. I'll tell you right now, UCLA is very unhappy with USC. It has nothing to do with sports. UCLA is unhappy because even though it's a premier public institution in California, they're losing faculty to USC, to private schools in the South, to schools in the Northeast who are paying athlete-level salaries to professors. They're stealing whole departments practically. Whole laboratories are going to Texas. Wasn't it Rice that stole a whole laboratory? Well, this is pretty serious business. It also suggests that the UCs and Cal States are not necessarily enemies in this process if the biggest cost driver is happening outside the California public education system. Go to the next page because I'm going to come back. So what should we do? And then I want to go back to the last point there. The talk is coming from Washington, D.C. I see what Obama is doing here as being a catalyst. He's not actually providing the battle plan for what to do. It's going to be up to everybody else to figure out how to play it. I can tell you right now the elite private universities are very unhappy about this. Actually, I think a lot of the R1 state universities are very unhappy about this. I predict that pretty soon they will hire Frank Luntz. This is a job for Frank Luntz. Let me tell you who Frank Luntz is. Frank Luntz is the political consultant who comes up with little two-word phrases for policies, like death panels for health care. Well, what do they call it? Cost control is the first thing they've said. Cost containment. They need something better than that. They need something that says the president wants to kill people. Or it's already been used, so it's probably hard to use death panels again. How about, don't worry, they'll pay him, they'll come up with something. Cost containment is not going to be it. But what's going to end up happening is this big political battle is now going to start to shape up. Keep your powder dry. Don't jump into it yet. Let's wait and see if the elite private universities end up cutting their own throats, which is perfectly possible. They do believe they are like gods. And they should be able to spend any amount of money at any time, day or night, and the voters don't agree with that. Well, I wouldn't ally with them at this moment. I would never get in the way of someone who's about to destroy themselves with a particular argument like that. This is really going to be a battle about public facilities versus private to some degree. Presidents often get what they want, but at the very least, presidents can create new conversations around which people do things. Obama's a bit of a student of Franklin Roosevelt, by the way, and Franklin Roosevelt said something very wise once. A group of very active people came to him and said, Mr. President, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And Roosevelt looked him in the eye and said, make me. He said, what? And they went home and thought about what he was saying. What he was saying was, create a context out there that makes me do it. Don't ask me to do it so you can have it. What you need to do is make it happen. Now, one reason his fortunes have come back is a group of forces in the country, Occupy and others, changed the context of the discussion. They made him move probably in the direction he wanted to move. But they made it possible for him to do that. So I would keep in mind that there's no marching orders here. I mean, who would give marching orders to a bunch of university people anyway? Like, we would actually listen. But you can create a context. But the battle is not in Washington. The battle's in Sacramento. I know, nobody wants to go to Sacramento. But the fact of the matter is, this Cal State system is perfectly situated to emerge out of this debate as the poster child for what's being talked about in terms of value. Well, I'm going to point out, if you try too hard to win that battle, you're going to lose the battle. I'll tell you what I mean by that. I had an insight about this. Actually, I didn't have an insight. I bought an Insight. I bought a Honda Insight. This will be relevant, trust me. I live in Santa Monica. I was commuting here for 30 years. Put a lot of miles on my old car. So I went and I started pricing things. And everybody was buying a Prius because they wanted to have a Prius. Turned out it got the same mileage as the Insight. It even looked the same. I walk into my neighbor's Prius all the time, and the police are going to arrest me because I think it's my car. However, the Insight gets the same mileage, drives just as well, and costs a little bit less. That was my insight. We are the Insight of higher education. But here's the trick. You don't become the Insight by offering 20 miles a gallon just to have a lower price. It has to be the same or better value for a lower price, which is the danger you get into in thinking that we walk into a value debate, which I believe we can win. I believe we're California's greatest bargain in education. Maybe the country's greatest bargain. People love bargains, but only if it's quality. And remember, the value debate starts with being about price, then it's about quality, and then you divide those two and you get value. If you sacrifice the quality to think you're going to buy off some legislator who's going to suddenly say, you're teaching a little bit less good stuff, so I'll give you more money, forget it. You won't be teaching as good stuff, and they still won't give you the money. Keep the values as well as the value. And in fact, I think one of the sad stories of our system in the last year is when we sacrificed the American institutions requirement. when the trustees unanimously voted to eliminate the requirement that every Cal State student must take the American Institutions requirement. And I know, because I was there, the debate was like, and they were all thinking they were going to really impress the legislature. And a few of the trustees said, boy, the legislature keeps saying if we don't get people to graduation faster and get this thing out of the way. And I'm thinking, they're going to cut you anyway. But you've taken your own value and thrown it in the garbage to impress people who aren't going to give you a dime anyway. It was a mistake. I think it's maybe a recoverable mistake. I think probably not. So I think what you keep in mind is we can win this argument. The president is situating us to be the poster child for his proposals. Have we engaged in this debate? I don't think so. I think we've all been too defensive. I think there's a lot of defensiveness that says we're going to prove our value if we have to strip our car down to nothing. That doesn't prove your value. That just proves you have a crummy car. Look, go back to ignorance. Most people don't know what we're doing. So why get rid of something good we're doing to impress people who don't even know what we're doing in the first place? And here's where I'll conclude, which is, we talked today, everybody said the same thing in a way, which I really agreed with. We have a great case to make. And I'm adding to that by saying we are the value people. Well, it's got to be a little better than that, but we are California's greatest bargain. And then I saw some polling and other numbers, and people said we've got a majority here and we got a majority. We have a very soft majority. We don't have the kind of majority that does what really matters. Somebody once pointed out that the way to move a legislator is one of two things: what you can do for them and what you can do to them. And nobody ever included a good argument in that. Would I rather have a good argument than a bad argument? Absolutely. But without two other things, that argument goes nowhere. And number one is a vision. We don't have a vision of what we want this to look like, except don't cut us anymore. And please, after you stop cutting us, Mom, send money. That's our vision right now. That's because we're desperate. But that's not a vision. A vision is getting a man to the moon in 10 years. That's a vision. Not, can we have a little bit more money for the space program? And once you have a vision, then it's a matter of thinking how you move people. And sad to say, good arguments don't always move them. Sometimes bad arguments move them. Look, those of you who have raised kids and put them in sports and everything know that there's certain words you're not supposed to use, like everybody gets a trophy. Last place team, everybody gets a trophy. You know, the kid drops a fly ball with 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth, and they go, oh, Barry, it's all right. You think, oh, cool. But you don't let them hear it. We're not supposed to make people feel guilty. We're not supposed to scare people. And my God, we should never shame people. Well, I'm here to tell you those are the 3 greatest assets in politics: guilt, shame, and fear. When I hear people say, we want them to really listen to us, the way they listen to us now is, well, that was nice. They're so cute when they're angry. They came in with a cute little proposal. The numbers were so nice, and you know, those professors are just the most, they're so adorable. I could just hug them. What you want is to make people feel guilt, shame, and fear. Now, I'm here to tell you, you don't have to be mean to do those things, although I would say it helps. But guilt, shame, and fear means you're the reason we're going to hell right now. You are. And you should be ashamed of that. And I'm going to remind everybody about the shame you have. And on election day, you should be afraid of the wrath of people who know what you have done. Like that? It has a certain je ne sais quoi, wouldn't you say? Now, I'm not naive enough to think we're all going to turn into New Jersey politicians in about 5 minutes, except to say I don't want you to get your heart broken by showing up with a beautifully tailored argument being patronized and sent home with a $100 million cut. you have to think a little bit about why people change their minds. The payroll tax was extended this year because the members of the House of Representatives were first pointed out, shamed, and then terrified. And they couldn't wait to pass it. They called up the president practically and said, could you sign it in an hour? And Obama said, well, when I get around to it. You know, he was having some fun. He wasn't having fun last time in the debate because, as tends to be his professorial approach, he went to them and said, you know, this is a marvelous stimulus program. And he likes to say things like, it just doesn't make sense. Every time he says that, I want to squeeze his neck. You don't say it doesn't make sense because nobody cares if it doesn't make sense. They want to know, should they be afraid of going against you? So think about the fact, though, that if you have a vision, if there's a vision out there, you don't want to be the one who's getting in the way of it. In fact, you'd like to be the one who has their name on a piece of legislation that will live in history. Now, of course, we could save a lot of time, given that we've now brought back a flower that is, what, 30,000 years old? Does anybody know how old that one was? Pat Brown didn't die that long ago that we couldn't get some DNA and bring that guy back. Because in the 1950s, it wasn't much different than now. And he just said, my vision is affordable college for every kid in California. And I'm not going to take no for an answer. There's not been a single governor, Democratic or Republican, who has touched that since Pat Brown. And did you know that Pat Brown never went to college? He went to law school. Didn't go to college. Couldn't afford it. His father couldn't afford it. So what drove him was not some kind of elitist debate about liberal arts, which I believe in and love. It was about opportunity for kids like him that the next generation would have that feeling coming in. Now we're starting to get somewhere toward something you can walk with a little bit that stands up and talks just a little bit. So I think either we could bring them back, we could channel them, we could do a lot of different things, but remember, he wasn't always the most exciting person in the world, but what he had was visions that were exciting. You don't need to be exciting if you've got an exciting vision. And after a while, people wanted to be part of it. They didn't pat him on the head and say, go away now. They said, what can we do? So what I would say to you is, let's not reinvent ourselves out of existence. Stop doing what we do well. Let's not be defensive. But let's engage in a way that will make people sit up and take notice. Thanks.
I'm sure there are lots of questions, so why don't we just jump right into that? And let me apologize if I slip out early because I have a class here in a while.
You'll have to tell us when to stop if you leave. Will Keith take over?
Good afternoon.
CFO.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Take care.
Okay, here we go. Professor, you and I have some discussions.
The mudslinging begins.
How much of race is involved in the new budget discussions? You know, I was talking to some Orange County folks, and when we talk about raising their taxes, first of all, they're not for it, especially in Orange County. But it struck me, a lot of it was they couldn't identify with that elementary school Jose or Lupe.
Right.
Right? The idea that I want to invest in their education, it's just not there. So how much of it is that, and what do we need to do to convince that group?
Wait. Basically, half of it is age and time. If you look at the younger electorate in California, which is going to be heavily Latino, increasingly Asian American, no matter where they live, they're going to be heavy supporters of investment in public services. That's what the polls already show. Willing to pay higher taxes. And they're increasing their role in the electorate. It's only partly race. In fact, another whole block of voters who are white are among the most pro-education people in the state. It has to do with ideology and age. And we right now have a much older electorate than we have population. And it's going to take a while for the voting totals to catch up. But the good news about that is it means that history is on the side of public education if you can just hang on. It is don't give up now because the tide of things is actually going to go in a more pro-education direction. And I heard a couple of questions that were asked back here about first-generation people coming up. Look, you folks know who's in your classes. You know how people who are having the first kid in their family go to college feel about college. And it just makes your heart beat faster. It's like, this is what I'm doing here. Now, we can complain that we're educating kids who need a lot of services, or we can say, we got the lucky break. We've got the people who are excited about this. This is going to be the people who are going to run California. We're going to make sure they're ready to do it. So anyway, it gives me a feeling that it's nice to be on the right side of history every once in a while. Lately, I've often felt like I'm on the wrong side of history. In this case, in California, we're on the right side of history. David?
Okay, Rafe. Is there any danger that Citizens United could have an effect on higher ed policy in this country?
Well, that's a really good question. If everybody knows, Citizens United is the fabulous Supreme Court decision which allows individuals and corporations to give unlimited, unaccountable money to whoever they want as long as they don't coordinate it with the campaign. Marvelous. The deciding vote on that, by the way, was cast by Justice Kennedy, who said the American people really are not going to have to worry about undue influence in elections, and my evidence so far shows they aren't really all that concerned about it. I would like to be a Supreme Court justice, so I could live in a tree. I don't see any evidence that this money is being spent in a way regarding education. However, what it does do is it allows flows of money that we don't know about to move in very quickly. And I would imagine the for-profit university system is going to generate a lot of that money. And they may show up in close races where people have taken a position similar to President Obama's about private universities. And I do believe there is another side to this debate that would go right back to where we were more than a year or two ago and start pouring resources back into these private universities. So that's where I would watch out for that. You may not know, by the way, that the Supreme Court has voted to take up a version of the Citizens United case. And I think what's going on is 4 justices on the Supreme Court think that Justice Kennedy, who is extremely interested in his role in history, talk about shame, guilt, and fear, they want this case to come back to him one more time and let him see what's happened in the time that this has passed. And he's a pretty honest guy. We'll see if he's willing to look at actual, and I think they're bargaining or gambling that it's worth bringing the case back only because of him to show him some of the results. Yesterday, Newt Gingrich's principal backer said he opposes the idea of wealthy people putting their money into campaigns, but then he said, what the heck, everybody's doing it. So he said he's going to put up to $100 million in Newt Gingrich's campaign. Money well spent, clearly. By the way, just for those of you on the inside, that's money spent to protect Romney's nomination, not Gingrich's, by preventing Santorum from moving farther. That's a stalking horse for Romney, but that's not relevant to our discussion, unless you want it to be.
And we've got time for one more question, and no pressure.
Hi, I'm Kara Watson. I represent the Brea Chamber of Commerce, and to speak to the business side of things that we talked about earlier as far as Orange County businesses, do you think there's an advantage to the Cal State system kind of breaking away from education as a whole? Because when you talk to voters and when you talk to business leaders, they tend to lump in K-12 and the CSU system into one, and the reality is that you don't get the categorical mandates that K-12 does and things like that. So do you think that if there's an education curve that needs to happen towards the voters, because if you could go out there and tell the business community what you're doing as far as efficiency, you would get a whole lot more support than I think the K-12 educators would, because you really are doing what they're asking. So
I think that's a very interesting question. Very interesting. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes me stop and think for a couple of minutes, because one of the things I'm already counseling is don't get pulled into everybody else's fight. Don't get pulled into the private elite universities. Be careful how you deal with the UCs, friends and competitors, whatever. It's a very interesting question because it's almost two different conversations, right? The conversation about K-12 is one whole conversation. The community college is one whole conversation, which, by the way, I think has more to do with national service than it does with education. It's the closest thing we've got to a mechanism for everybody to do 2 years after high school of national service and be learning something and moving them forward, but it's not the same as what we do. I find that a very interesting and intriguing question, which is if we're a big enough system to make a case that we then would invite others to piggyback on, but not necessarily to offer ourselves up as sacrificial lambs for everything called education anywhere in the United States. Kind of what you're saying? I think that's a very well taken point.
And
I think we're out of time.
with that, join me in saying thank you to Professor Sonnenschein.
Thank you.